Imagine for a moment that you wake up surrounded by silk sheets, gold inlays glinting on the walls, and attendants ready to serve your every whim. To the outside world, this is the dream, the pinnacle of wealth, luxury, and privilege. This is what people imagine when they think of royalty in history. But inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, the reality was far darker. Because if you were one of the 400 women chosen to live inside the Sultan's harem, luxury was nothing more than a gilded mask. Behind the curtains, past the marble halls, beneath the endless fountains and gardens, there was only fear. The harem was never about romance. It was never about beauty. It was about control, a system perfected over centuries that reduced women to statistics, to pieces on a board, to names on slips of parchment carried on a silver tray. Step inside this world, and you entered a prison disguised as paradise, one where a single glance, a single mistake, even the rhythm of your own heartbeat could decide whether you lived to see another day. Each evening, as the call to prayer echoed over Istanbul and the last sunlight slipped across the waters of the Bosphorus, the true terror began. Inside the golden hall of the harem, hundreds of women waited. Some were as young as 13, others no older than their mid-20s. They stood in silence, eyes fixed forward, breaths shallow. They knew that within minutes, footsteps would echo through the corridor, the sound of attendants carrying the tray that sealed their fates. On that tray were slips of parchment, each one bearing a name. Tonight, one name would be chosen. The woman behind that name would be summoned, led away, prepared for the Sultan. From the outside, it might sound like honor, even privilege, but the women inside knew the truth. Being chosen was not a gift. It was a gamble. It was a coin toss between elevation and erasure. For every woman who survived, another vanished before dawn. The Sultan himself rarely took responsibility for choosing. That would imply accountability. Instead, it was eunuchs who performed the lottery. The randomness of it was not accidental. It was deliberate by turning the selection into a game of chance. The palace cultivated constant dread. Imagine waiting for your name to be pulled from a bowl, knowing it might mean the end of your life, yet forced to smile and bow as though you were grateful. And if your body betrayed you, that was enough to condemn you. Palace records from 1640 describe one such case. A young woman named Aishi, 17 years old, originally from the Black Sea coast, had lived in the harem for 3 years. On November 15th, her name was drawn. But when attendants came for her, they discovered she was in the middle of her monthly cycle. By morning, she was gone. The official record listed her death as sudden illness, but everyone inside knew the truth. Her body had simply chosen the wrong night. This is the horror no history book tells you, that the very biology of these women was turned against them. A process no one could control became grounds for execution. The harem reduced life itself to an impossible test, but the nightmare did not end with selection. Once chosen, a woman would be led to the preparation chamber. There, 12 eunuchs, trained as medical examiners, would surround her. They would decide whether she was fit to keep her ability to bear children. The phrasing was clinical. Should the seed be preserved? If the answer was no, procedures were scheduled, ending her possibility of motherhood forever. If yes, she was permitted to proceed. knowing that even if she entered the Sultan's chamber, failure to conceive within a certain time frame would send her back to the same cold evaluation. Imagine the weight of that question. Imagine knowing that strangers held the power to erase not just your future, but the very essence of your identity as a woman in a world where motherhood defined worth. The statistics reveal just how hopeless the system was. Of 400 women, only 10, at most, would bear children. 10. The rest existed in a limbo of dread, waiting, hoping, and fearing. For them, the best outcome was to be ignored. The worst was to be remembered. This system wasn't random cruelty. It was organized with chilling precision. Records were kept, procedures documented. Every death was processed like paperwork. The palace functioned like a machine, efficient and cold, grinding lives into silence with bureaucratic regularity. And woven into this machinery was another layer of torment, psychological warfare, the random selection, the enforced gratitude, the calculated cruelty. All of it served a purpose. By keeping the women in a state of uncertainty, the palace prevented rebellion. By rewarding betrayal, it fostered division. Women were encouraged to report on each other, to sabotage rivals, even to celebrate when others were taken away. Unity was impossible because trust itself had been poisoned. European ambassadors who visited the palace during these centuries were horrified. These were men from nations where burning women alive as witches was seen as reasonable. Yet even they wrote with shock about the cruelty of the Ottoman system. To them, it was industrialized misery, femicide disguised as ceremony. But perhaps the darkest part of all was the way the system forced women to turn against themselves. Some drank concoctions that destroyed their ability to have children, preferring the certainty of barrenness to the uncertainty of selection. Others hid their intelligence, their wit, their education, knowing that a clever woman was rarely chosen. The palace didn't want minds, it wanted silence, obedience, and flesh. Now pause for a moment and picture yourself as one of those women, a teenager, ripped from your family, your village, your life. You stand in the hall, your heart pounding as the tray approaches. Every instinct tells you to run, but there is nowhere to go. Every smile hides fear. Every silence hides despair. The palace walls glisten with gold, but inside them is nothing but dread. Most women broke. Most submitted quietly, hoping to be forgotten, praying for obscurity. But not all. One young woman looked at the system and decided she would not be erased. She studied its patterns, learned its weaknesses, and turned its weapons back on itself. She became more than a survivor. She became its master. Her name was Alexandra, a girl of 15 stolen from her Ukrainian village. The world would remember her as Roxolana or Hurrem Sultan. She would become the only woman ever buried beside a sultan. She would become the architect of death for her rivals, and she would prove that sometimes, to survive in hell, you must become something far darker than the flames around you. And that is where our story shifts from the machinery of horror to the story of the girl who bent it to her will. But what did it cost her soul to do so? That, my friends, is the most haunting question of all. When Alexandra first stepped inside the glittering labyrinth of Topkapi Palace, she was just another broken girl in a sea of captives. The daughter of an Orthodox priest from Ukraine, she had been taken by raiders, chained, and sold like livestock in the markets of Istanbul. At 15 years old, her life had already been stripped away. For most, that was the end of the story. They would disappear into the endless corridors of the harem, swallowed by silence and bureaucracy. But Alexandra chose another path. She decided, with a clarity beyond her years, that if she could not escape the system, she would become its master. She studied everything. While other girls wept for home, Alexandra turned her grief into discipline. She threw herself into learning the palace languages. Within 6 months, she spoke Turkish, Arabic, and Persian with such fluency that even her accent disappeared. To the women around her, this looked like diligence. In truth, it was camouflage. She understood that language wasn't just communication, it was survival. If she could erase every trace of her foreignness, she could blend in. If she could blend in, she could wait. And if she could wait, she could strike. But language was only the beginning. Alexandra watched the palace itself as if it were a living organism. She memorized the routines of the eunuchs, the timing of the guards, the whispers of attendants. She learned which corridors stayed dark at night, which doors were opened with which keys, which servants carried secrets in their silence. The harem wasn't just a prison, it was a machine, and she intended to learn every gear, every cog, every hidden spring. Her sharpest focus, however, was the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of one of the largest empires in the world, a man who commanded armies, dictated law, and lived surrounded by loyalty and fear. Most women treated him with awe, trembling in his presence. Alexandra did the opposite. She studied him as if he were a puzzle. She noticed his interests, his moods, his habits. When he turned to poetry, she memorized verses. When he debated politics, she shaped opinions that matched his. She didn't just reflect him, she anticipated him. Slowly, she wove herself into his life, not as another concubine, but as his confidant. Her genius lay in unpredictability. She practiced what modern psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. At times, she was warm, affectionate, open. At other times, she grew distant, aloof, leaving Suleiman reaching for her attention. The rhythm of her affection kept him unsettled, craving her presence, addicted to her unpredictability. In a palace where everyone obeyed him, Roxolana made him chase. But she did not rise on charm alone. She engineered her opportunities. In 1524, the palace caught fire, a terrifying but not uncommon event in buildings filled with wooden beams and oil lamps. While others fled in panic, Alexandra ran into the flames to save a manuscript of Suleiman's poetry. She emerged coughing, clutching the book to her chest, presenting it to him as though she had risked her life for his words. But records suggest something more sinister. The fire began in a storeroom only Alexandra had access to. Was it an accident, or had she created the crisis in order to play the hero? Whatever the truth, the result was undeniable. Suleiman began to see her not as a possession, but as a partner. Over the next decade, Roxolana achieved something no concubine had dared attempt in 5 centuries. She convinced the Sultan to marry her. Ottoman law and tradition forbade such unions. Marriage complicated succession, and the harem existed precisely to prevent such entanglements. But Roxolana was relentless. Through carefully crafted letters, whispered conversations, and calculated displays of devotion, she persuaded Suleiman that their love was unique, destined, eternal, against precedent, against tradition, against the advice of his council. He made her his wife. It was a triumph, but it was also the beginning of something darker, because once she became his wife, once she bore his children, Roxolana's survival depended on eliminating threats. And the greatest threat of all was Prince Mustafa. Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son, born to another concubine before Roxolana arrived. He was admired by the military, respected by the court, and beloved by the people. By all accounts, he was everything a future sultan should be: competent, disciplined, charismatic. But to Roxolana, he was an obstacle. If Mustafa inherited the throne, her children would be discarded, erased just as so many others had been. For Roxolana, the path was clear. Mustafa had to die. She did not use poison or assassins. That would have been too crude. Instead, she wove a net of whispers. She planted rumors that Mustafa plotted rebellion. She forged letters suggesting he courted rival powers. She instructed her agents to spread doubt, to drip poison into the ears of Suleiman day after day. For years, she worked patiently, turning father against son. Finally, in 1553, Suleiman believed the illusion. He summoned Mustafa to his tent during a military campaign. The young prince entered unarmed, loyal, unsuspecting. Within minutes, he was strangled by Suleiman's guards. Roxolana watched from behind a screen as the life drained from the empire as most promising heir. A murder she had orchestrated without ever lifting a hand. This was the turning point. Roxolana was no longer simply a survivor. She was a force, a strategist, a woman who could shape the empire from behind the veil. She established networks of informants across the palace, turning the culture of betrayal into her own intelligence service. She eliminated rivals with precision. Some vanished into exile, others into silence. Each move cleared the path for her sons. Historians today argue over her legacy. Some call her a pioneer, a woman who shattered gender barriers and proved that influence could be seized even in the most oppressive of systems. She became a political advisor, a patron of architecture, a correspondent with foreign rulers. She built mosques, hospitals, schools, monuments that stand even today. But others call her a manipulator, a schemer whose ambition left a trail of corpses. She secured her dynasty, yes, but at the cost of countless lives, including children. Perhaps the truth is that she was both: a victim who became an oppressor, a prisoner who became a queen, a woman who had to trade her soul for survival. But pause here for a moment. Imagine her life not in terms of ambition, but in terms of necessity. The system gave her no options. If she remained obedient, she would be discarded. If she resisted, she would be erased. Her only chance to protect herself, her children, her future, was to play the game harder than anyone else, to outwit, outmaneuver, outlast. She became what the system required: ruthless, calculating, merciless. And yet, even in her darkest acts, she left behind traces of vulnerability. Letters to Suleiman survive, filled with love, devotion, and longing. Were they sincere? Or were they carefully crafted performances designed to keep his trust? We may never know. But one chilling detail stands out. After Mustafa's death, she wrote Suleiman a poem praising his wisdom, his justice, his vision. Every line framed his cruelty as righteousness, his paranoia as foresight. She didn't just manipulate events, She manipulated the meaning of those events, ensuring her husband saw his own brutality as noble. For Roxolana, love itself was a weapon. She reigned beside Suleiman for nearly 4 decades. By the time of her death in 1558, she had achieved something no woman before her had ever dreamed. She was buried beside a sultan, her tomb standing next to his in Istanbul. In life, she had been his partner, his confidant, his conspirator. In death, she remained his equal, a statement carved in stone against the traditions she had shattered. But her story leaves us with a haunting question. Was she truly a monster, or was she the inevitable product of a monstrous system? Because for every Roxolana who rose to power, hundreds of others never did. They faced the strangler's cord, the leather sack, the silent exile of forgotten palaces. Their stories vanished, their names erased, their lives reduced to footnotes in palace ledgers. Roxolana's legacy is not just about the heights she reached, it is also about the countless bodies left behind in the shadows of her ascent. And perhaps that is the final horror of the Ottoman harem. Not just the brutality of the system, but the way it forced its captives into impossible choices. To survive, you had to destroy others. To preserve yourself, you had to erase yourself. And sometimes, the only way to win was to become something unrecognizable. So, the next time you think of history's great empires, of their domes and palaces and armies, remember this. Behind the gold and marble, behind the grandeur and glory, there are always silenced voices, forgotten women, lives consumed to maintain the illusion of power. And Roxolana, the girl who became a queen, forces us to ask a question that still lingers 5 centuries later. If you were trapped in that system, would you choose to die a victim or live as a monster? If this story has unsettled you, if it has made you think about history in a way your textbooks never did, then I invite you to subscribe. Together, we'll keep unearthing these forgotten shadows, bringing light to the darkest corners of the past. And now, I leave you with one final thought. Roxolana's last letter to Suleiman, written as she lay dying, ended with these words: History will remember our love. Let them forget the rest. But history has not forgotten the rest, and neither should we. Tell me in the comments, if you had been in Roxolana's place, would you have chosen love as a weapon, power as a shield, or silence as your fate?